Steelers trade talks intensifying. A report has revealed a perfect move for the Pittsburgh Steelers. My name is Peyton Kleppe, and on today's episode of Steelers Digest, we'll be breaking down the latest Pittsburgh Steelers analysis and reports regarding the Pittsburgh Steelers football team. As the Pittsburgh Steelers look to add another offensive playmaker, they could look to add another guy that is coming out of the Arthur Smith offense. Before we get into the latest reports, if you guys are not already currently subscribed to the channel, click that subscribe button down below. 91% of our current viewers are not actually currently subscribed. So if you click that subscribe button, we will get you the latest Pittsburgh Steelers reports. So like I said, the Pittsburgh Steelers are looking to add another offensive playmaker. They are reportedly interested in Jonnu Smith. This guy is coming off of a Pro Bowl season with the Dolphins, and obviously he did have a ton of success with Arthur Smith in Tennessee. So, in an article by Matt Brandon, the Pittsburgh Steelers are looking to explore a trade for Dolphins tight end Jonnu Smith, who, his fantasy football value hangs in balance amid contract talks and an uncertain offensive role. Obviously, the Dolphins had a pretty down year last year, really did not have a lot of success. Tua was obviously hurt a lot. Tyreek Hill is definitely not the same guy he used to be in Kansas City, and they were having a lot of trouble. But, the one bright spot on their offense was Jonnu Smith, a guy who was counted out by so many different people, coming off of short stints with, the Atlanta Falcons and the New England Patriots and obviously Tennessee Titans. But, nobody would have expected this guy to come in there and have the success that he did have. He is an athletic guy, and, he did have a lot of success when he was first drafted in Tennessee. But, despite the Pittsburgh Steelers' ongoing uncertainty at the quarterback position, Pittsburgh appears intent on beefing up its arsenal, and adding Jonnu Smith is the latest name on the radar. Obviously, earlier on this offseason, we were interested in Kyle Pitts, another guy coming out of the Arthur Smith offense in Atlanta, and a guy like Chris Olave, who, has a lot of upside, but has dealt with a lot of injuries and concussions. But, according to ESPN's Adam Schefter, the Miami Dolphins have held trade discussions with the Pittsburgh Steelers regarding the veteran tight end, who's seeking a new contract as he is heading into the final year of a deal that would only pay him $4.8 million. The talks are open for a potential reunion with the current Steelers offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, who previously coached Jonnu during the three separate stints, obviously with the Titans in 2019 and 2020, and then he did reunite with him in Atlanta in 2023, where Jonnu Smith did have a better season than their first-round draft pick, Kyle Pitts. So, Jonnu Smith is a guy that he's not a big name, but, under Arthur Smith's offense, he's definitely had a lot of success in the past. So, if we could bring him in, trade a mid-round pick over to, to Miami, I'd love to bring this guy in alongside Freiermuth, alongside Darnell Washington, and, Connor Hayward, a little gadget guy, Connor Hayward. And we also added a guy like Donald Parham earlier on this offseason, who is an athletic guy who's been a journeyman. He's been on a few different teams, but he is a big offensive weapon as well. So, it does also add a competition in the tight end group. If we add a guy like Jonnu Smith, you're going to be fighting for that number one spot. Freiermuth definitely has the financial part on his side with the big contract he did sign a few years ago. But, bringing in Jonnu Smith, he's pretty comparable to Pat Freiermuth. Both these guys can be offensive threats. So it would bring a sense of competition into that tight end room and would hold Pat Freiermuth accountable to really step up and have that big season that we've all been waiting for him to have. But, if we look at Jonnu Smith's fantasy outlook, coming off the season he did have in Miami, Smith did seize the opportunity that did happen. Obviously, like I said earlier, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle both got injured. So Jonnu Smith is really the lone weapon on that Dolphins offense, but he did erupt for a career high, 88 catches, 884 yards on 111 targets. So, that's a better season than Muth has ever had. So if we did bring in Jonnu Smith, he's probably going to be more of our number two option for whatever quarterback we do have in Pittsburgh, whether that is Mason Rudolph, whether that is Will Howard, or if that is Aaron Rodgers. We will have to wait and see. But, whichever guy is throwing that football, if we do have Jonnu Smith on our offense, it's going to make it a whole lot easier, bringing another weapon across the middle. Jonnu Smith, he is a guy that, if we look at his stats in the past, he did have a pretty consistent season these past couple years. Obviously, like I said, the 884-yard season, 8 touchdowns. But with the Falcons, the last year he did have with Arthur Smith, he had 582 yards with 50 catches and added 3 touchdowns to that. He was the second tight end in the offense at the time. They did have Kyle Pitts, the rookie, or he wasn't a rookie at that time, but he was a first-round draft pick. So, he wasn't even the number 1 tight end in Atlanta, and he was still putting up these numbers. Obviously, if we look back at his Patriots stint, it was definitely forgettable for Jonnu Smith. He was dealing with some injuries when he signed that big contract to go to New England. But before going to New England, he did have a lot of success with the Titans, like I said before. 448 yards with 8 touchdowns. And, if we bring this guy into Pittsburgh, I think he's really going to help our offense and really just add another piece that we could throw to, another option that we can add to our offense with the departure of George Pickens. Jonnu Smith is a guy, high character guy. You don't really hear about any off the field issues with him, so we wouldn't have to worry about anything like that. Obviously, that was the big issue with George Pickens. He was super talented, had a lot of production, but just did a lot of dumb stuff on and off the field. But, adding a guy like Jonnu Smith, he's not going to add any of that, off the field noise, any of that junk. So he's just going to come in and produce, stay healthy. This guy is an athletic tight end. We really have not had a super athletic pass catching tight end in Pittsburgh since I can really remember. If we go back, we had Vance McDonald. He was a big guy, but more of a blocking tight end. We had a guy like Jesse James, where he was another big guy, not really a passing catching tight end, more of a blocking guy. And then if we go all the way back, we had a guy like Heath Miller. So, bringing in a guy like Jonnu Smith, an athletic pass-catching tight end, would be really uncharacteristic for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But, change is sometimes for the best. And bringing in a guy that could change our offense in a whole different way, kind of open up that offense for guys like Calvin Austin that we could maybe throw on the outside and maybe Roman Wilson in the slot. Bringing a guy like Jonnu Smith just adds a whole nother offensive threat that the Pittsburgh Steelers can take advantage of as we try to develop these other young receivers we do have in the wide receiver room. Like I said earlier, we do have a guy like Calvin Austin who definitely has a lot of high upside, but we still have to wait and see if he can prove that he can be a number 2 option and be that number 2 wide receiver on the outside. That is a big question for Calvin Austin, obviously due to his size. He is a smaller guy, but he has a ton of speed. He's a great route runner, and he can also make some great catches. So I think the Pittsburgh Steelers will look to trade for Jonnu Smith. If not Jonnu Smith, the Pittsburgh Steelers could look to trade for Kyle Pitts. He is a name that is also been thrown around for trade discussions. So keep your eyes out and keep your ears open. Unfortunately, that is all I have for you guys tonight on Steelers Digest. If you guys are not already currently subscribed to the channel, click that subscribe button down below. Here we go, Steelers. Peace out, boys.